All right, guys, so I wanted to do a video because, you know, I've been talking about chatterbaits for a very long time, and recently I've been talking more about the Jackhammer chatterbait. The Jackhammer is just a bait that has just been on fire. People have been really catching a lot of fish on it, and this is what gets talked about most, I think, is the Jackhammer chatterbait. However, I want to talk about the complete chatterbait setup that I have and that I've kind of whittled down over the years and fine-tuned and perfected. And it's not all about the Jackhammer, even though the Jackhammer probably plays the biggest role when it comes to fishing chatterbaits nowadays for me. I actually use a lot of the different chatterbaits in the Chatterbait line from Z-Man. So I wanted to go through the chatterbaits that I use. There's 4 different chatterbaits that I use on a regular basis that I have in the boat at all times. And then the trailers that I use, there's 3 different trailers that I generally use 90% of the time. And then also the rod, reel, and line setup that I use for fishing chatterbaits. So let's get started. All right, so let's talk about the elephant in the room. This little puppy right here. This is the Jackhammer chatterbait. This is actually Fire Craw, which is a very popular color right now, and I've still got quite a few of these, so I'm pretty stoked that I got them before everybody started buying them up, and now they're just really hard to come by. I think you can get them on like eBay for like 50 bucks, but I'm lucky enough to have a few. I'll be honest with you, I haven't really caught that many fish on this color yet, but I haven't used it during the prime time of the year, which is, you know, it's kind of getting over right now. We're starting to shift into the spawn instead of the pre-spawn in wintertime, which this is really popular in the South. But the Jackhammer overall is just such a great bait. This is the one that a lot of people have been talking about. You know, a lot of tournaments have been won. I know I've made a lot of money over the last 2 years fishing the FLW Pro Circuit off of the Jackhammer. And the great thing about the Jackhammer is, number one, the action. The action of this bait is just tremendous. It's got a lot of vibration, and it also has a hunting action, which means that it's actually got a little bit of a darting action in the water, and that changes from chatterbait to chatterbait. There's some jackhammers that I can throw out there and it doesn't hunt nearly as much, and generally speaking, the 3/8 ounce size will tend to dart a lot more than the bigger sizes as you go up. The 1/2 ounce is generally what I use the majority of the time. I think the 1/2 ounce I can maintain a certain depth range. I think it has a great action to it, and so that's what I use the majority of the time. But I found when I'm in shallow water, you know, maybe 2-3 feet, the 3/8 ounce really gets a lot of bites because it has a very, very erratic darting action to it. And besides the action of the Jackhammer, which really separates itself from other chatterbaits, the components of the Jackhammer are incredible. I mean, you've got the best components possible in a chatterbait. You've got, of course, the well-designed blade. The snap on the blade is probably what creates a lot of that really signature Jackhammer action. It's kind of an egg-shaped clip on there, and it does a really good job. I really like that clip a lot. I really haven't had any failures to speak of with that clip, and overall I think it gives it a really good action. But as you look at the Jackhammer, you can just tell that it's a higher quality bait. It's got some really lifelike components to it as far as the lifelike eyes. The paint jobs are just phenomenal, and then the skirt is just top notch. I mean, we've got great color combinations, including the Fire Craw, and then it's hand tied with a copper wire, which I really do think that it adds to the billowing action of this bait, and also obviously adds to the durability of this. I mean, when I go up to places like Lake Champlain, where there's a ton of toothy critters such as you know, pike and chain pickerel, I'm not going through very many of these baits because of that, which is a very, very common problem with the rubber banded baits out there. The other thing that I really like about the Jackhammer is the bait keeper is really, really good for carrying Elastec baits, which is what I use as my trailers, and then it's got a really sharp hook. So overall, this is just a great bait that's got a great action and has great components to it. So let's talk a little bit about where I fish the Jackhammer jackhammer, and I've already said that I use the jackhammer probably the majority of the time when I'm chatterbait fishing, but not all the time. Generally, when I'm reaching for a chatterbait to kind of start seeing if there's a chatterbait bite, I'll reach for the jackhammer. And if I'm fishing areas that are 3 foot or more, and also very deep, if I'm trying to fish it like a spoon or fish it in deeper water, there's 3/4 ounce and an ounce and a quarter version that get down to those depths. But generally speaking, the jackhammer does a really good job at not only having a great action, but staying down in the depth zone that you're wanting to fish. So it doesn't want to pull up to the surface like some of the other choices that I have in my chatterbait line. It actually will stay down in a depth zone fairly well. So I adjust the weight of my jackhammer to fit the conditions, but generally if I'm fishing 5 foot of water, I'll reach for a 1/2 ounce jackhammer, and that's a situation that I'm fishing a lot. And so if it's between 3 foot, 5 foot, I'm using a 3/8 ounce or a 1/2 ounce jackhammer to get to the depth that I'm looking for. I'm fishing around submerged grass a lot in those depth ranges. And then if I'm getting into deeper water, maybe ledge fishing, and need something that gets down there a little bit deeper, that's when I fish a 3/4 ounce or an ounce and a quarter jackhammer. But let's get into some other chatterbaits that really have been overshadowed by the jackhammer's success, but still are huge tools for me when I'm going to these different fisheries across the country. The next one is a Chatterbait Elite. Now, before the jackhammer, the Chatterbait Elite was the big guy on campus. This thing right here is just a fish catching machine, and they've kind of updated it over the years. Essentially, it's very similar to the original Chatterbait, but it has a bait keeper on here. It's got a 5/0 real sharp, real heavy duty hook. And then it's also got a heavy duty blade on it and a really heavy duty line tie. So if I'm fishing around for fish that are really, really big, you know, bigger on average size fish, and fishing dirtier water generally, this is a bait that I like to throw instead of the jackhammer on occasion. This is just still a really, really good bait. And the great thing about the Chatterbait Elite is it's not going to break the bank. So you've got some high-end components here, great action to it, but it's not as expensive as a jackhammer. So I love the Chatterbait Elite and still use it quite a bit, especially in dirtier water situations and situations where I'm fishing for really, really big fish, because that line tie, I can tell you right now, is not going to let you down. So Chatterbait Elite. Oh, and another thing that I want to mention about the Chatterbait Elite is the fact that the depth range is very similar to the jackhammer. So I'm fishing 3 to 5 foot of water with 3/8 ounce and 1/2 ounce versions, and generally those are the two sizes that I'm going to be using with the Chatterbait Elite for that type of depth range. All right, so let's get into a more specialized chatterbait. This right here is called the Project Z chatterbait. This, when it came out, was, you know, it had some of the most lifelike design to it. It was, I believe, the first to use this heavy-duty line tie. And just overall, it's got a really heavy-duty hook to it and a great bait keeper for your Elastec trailers. And the Project Z is really different as far as the action that it has versus the Chatterbait Elite and the jackhammer. It's got a very pronounced and consistent vibration. Okay, the blade movement is, you know, as soon as you start cranking that reel handle, that thing is going immediately, and it's very consistent, meaning that it doesn't have a lot of erratic hunting action. Okay, which is what I look for in both the Chatterbait Elite and the jackhammer. But in the Project Z, that just isn't the case. It just doesn't have much of a erratic action to it that I've found in most of the Project Zs that I have. But the special thing about the Project Z, though, is that it wants to pull to the surface. So when I'm working this bait, it really does want to lift towards the surface. Even with, you know, a 1/2 ounce version, I'm still fishing it, you know, 2 foot or less in a lot of occasions. And so it's not a great bait to get extra depth out of and maintain a deeper depth zone, but it is an excellent choice for fishing very shallow grass. I use this for fishing areas like tidal fisheries, areas where those fish are going to be super shallow, you know, sometimes a foot or less in some occasions. Like I fished a Bassmaster Open on the Atchafalaya Basin several years ago, and this was the chatterbait that I reached for because it was so good fishing through that really shallow eelgrass that I was fishing. It comes through grass like no other chatterbait, and because it wants to pull up to the surface, you're not constantly trying to fight yourself and fight that bait digging deep into the grass. This thing, if the grass is just a few inches above the surface, this bait will actually just tick above that, just raising the rod tip just a little bit. So if you're faced with really shallow vegetation, the regular Project Z is a great choice. And then next, in the Project Z line, they also introduced the Weedless Project Z. It's got the same components except for this little brush card right here. Does a really good job. If you guys know anything about chatterbaits, if you've ever thrown it around hard cover, whether it's dock posts, brush, laydowns, whatever it is, stumps, chatterbaits do not go through hard cover very well. That's why the Weedless Project Z does a great job, and it has the same kind of propensity to want to pull up to the surface and be in that shallower depth range. So again, I'm fishing it in very shallow water. You know, in the spring, as these lakes are rising up, as soon as those fish start getting around stumps and things like that, that's when this bait does really good, because it's not going to snag, and it's just like throwing a swim jig but a lot more vibration. So if you have dirty water and you need to pull it through harder cover and give them something a little bit different to look at, the Project Z Weedless is an excellent choice. All right, so before we move on to the trailers that I use for all these different chatterbaits, I know I said that I only had 4 chatterbaits that I use 90% of the time, but I also wanted to throw in a bonus for you. This one's new, and it's one that I really haven't used a whole lot. It's one that I'm experimenting right now with, but I have caught a lot of fish with, and I'm seeing some tremendous opportunity when it comes to fishing deeper water and also fishing hard bottoms and maintaining bottom contact. And that is with the new Chatterbait Freedom CFL. This chatterbait right here is a swing head design. It's got this hook that you can actually take off with that Freedom quick removal system they've got. It's a football head design. The head is actually made out of zinc, so it's a lot more durable. It creates a different sound down there. And it's got the heavy duty line tie on there, heavy duty blade, and just overall it's designed to kind of creep along the bottom. If you fished a swing head or something like a biffle head, that is kind of the niche that they're trying to accomplish, is give those fish something a little bit different that would normally maybe shy away from something like those swing head soft plastics. Now you've got a bait that has a lot more vibration, it's got a completely different action, a different sound, and you can put whatever soft plastic or Elastec trailer you want on there. So it's kind of fitting a whole different, niche. Keep an eye on this. This is something that's going to be a lot more popular as the years go by and people learn how to fish it. All right, so let's get into the trailers that I use for all these different chatterbaits. The Chatterbait CFL is a little bit different because I'm mixing in some creature baits that I generally don't use as trailers. But generally speaking, the 3, well, really the 2 that I've traditionally used, and then I've added a new one to my chatterbait trailer lineup recently. But the original 2 included the Diesel Minnows and the Razor Shads. The Diesel Minnows was the original one that I used. It's a perfect length, perfect profile. It's got a boot tail on it. It's got a lot of action. And that was the original one that I started using for my chatterbait trailers. And the great thing that I'll mention right off the bat about using Elastec trailers is, number one, they've got a ton of action. They're really soft. They've just got a lot of natural movement. But number two, they've got a lot of durability. It's just, they're extremely durable. So when you put them on a chatterbait and you put a little bit of super glue on there, that thing's going to stay on there and pretty much going to last just as long as the chatterbait. So you can catch 100 fish on one bait. But the diesel minnows is a great bait for fishing warmer water. The one thing about the diesel minnows, it does have that action on the tail, but one thing that a boot style swim bait tail will do for you is, if you're fishing for active fish that are real shallow, that are looking for that extra movement, this is a great choice. However, one thing that the boot style swim bait tends to do is it tends to kind of dampen that erratic hunting action with a chatterbait, which is something that you know, you don't want to overpower a chatterbait, but this bait does a good job at just bordering that line between adding action but not detracting too much action from it. It's just overall a great bait. This is probably the trailer that I reach for the majority of the time after the spawn all the way through the fall, especially if I'm just catching fish on a straight retrieve, or you know, a retrieve where I'm using a straight retrieve and then just kind of popping the rod tip a little bit and imparting action. So great trailer. The Razor Shads is one that I actually just started using last year. The first tournament of the season on the FLW Pro Circuit was Sam Rayburn, and I ended up getting a 12th place finish, and I was using this on a Jackhammer chatterbait. And the reason I've really started to use the Razor Shads more and more on a chatterbait is, number one, it's got less action. So during the pre-spawn and those colder months, the winter time, this bait does a much better job, because I'm generally catching those fish either with a yo-yo technique or a stop and go technique. And what happens with the Razor Shads versus the diesel minnows is, the diesel minnows, when you pause it, it wants to go straight down and it has that action on the fall, which isn't in itself a bad thing. But what I'm trying to accomplish when I'm you know, yo-yoing a bait during those sluggish times of the year is, I want that bait to kind of glide but not have a ton of action on the fall. So the diesel minnows does a great job. It tends to, on the fall, just kind of glide that chatterbait down, so it has a really good kind of almost a hair jig style fall with the diesel minnows, and it doesn't have a whole lot of action, so it doesn't overpower that bait. And speaking about overpowering that bait, the great thing about the Razor Shads is the fact that it actually adds to the action of the chatterbait. It doesn't take away, it doesn't dampen that erratic action that the Chatterbait Elite and the Jackhammer are known for, because it doesn't have that tail drag, okay? It doesn't have that boot style tail, so it doesn't tend to take away from any of that natural movement. So generally speaking, the colder times of the year, those situations where a hunting action is at a premium, and when I'm yo-yoing a chatterbait, that's when I'm going to be reaching for the Razor Shads. The next one that I've added to the arsenal that I really like, and this is one that I've just started using in recent months, is actually a saltwater Elastec bait from Z-Man. It's called the Swimmin Trout Trick. Okay, it's very small. It's you know, a lot more slender than the other trailers that I use. The one thing that I found about this trailer in particular is the fact that it doesn't tend to dampen the action of the chatterbait. So because it's such a small, narrow tail on there, it has a lot of action to it, but it doesn't tend to take away that hunting action. So I'm actually experimenting quite a bit with this, and the one thing that I've also found is, if you're trying to imitate smaller than average size bait fish, this is a really good choice, because it's a lot smaller, a little bit more slender, but it has a tremendous hunting action with those chatterbaits, because the tail's not big enough to create enough drag to stop it from hopping around. So the Swimmin Trout Trick, this is kind of a little a sleeper. This is something I don't think I've seen anybody throw as a trailer on my chatterbaits, and it's also my favorite trailer for my sling blades spinner baits that Z-Man makes too, because it doesn't have a big profile to it. It's just real small and narrow. So that's a secret. Keep that under your hat. Swimmin trout trick, it does the trick for sure. So let's get into the tackle that I use for chatterbaits to kind of wrap this video up. So the tackle that I use, I've actually got this right now rigged with a 5-inch diesel minnows that I've been experimenting with lately as a swim bait out here on Lake Chickamauga, and it's been doing pretty awesome. But the setup that I use for all these different chatterbaits pretty much is the same all around. I like to use a 7.3 medium heavy Fitzgerald Versa Series rod. And this is not a composite rod, it's not a glass rod, it's full graphite. And I like having a medium heavy graphite rod. And the reason for that is because a lot of guys really like that parabolic bend with a chatterbait rod, and they swear by it. But me in particular, I feel like I have a lot more confidence in the graphite rod because I feel like I have better feel with the chatterbait. I know what the chatterbait's doing at all times, and I feel like I can rip it through the grass a whole lot better. Maybe it's the fact that I've trained myself to hesitate before I set the hook on a fish, but one of the reasons that people use a composite or fiberglass rod is to allow that fish to really choke that bait before they react to it and set the hook. So it gives you a little bit of a slower reaction to that bite. And I really don't have that issue very often. I hesitate pretty much every single time a fish bites. I'm able to hesitate before I lean into them, and that's just maybe how I've learned and progressed over the years fishing a chatterbait or a spinnerbait or a crankbait, things like that. So I really prefer the 7.3 medium heavy. I feel like I can rip it through the grass a whole lot better. I'm less frustrated, and I can feel that chatterbait. And I really do like having a lot of backbone where I can take control of the fight, especially fishing around heavy cover and grass. And so the 7.3 is pretty much all I use. The reel that I use, I'm again a little bit different as far as the reel gear ratio that I use. I use a Fitzgerald Stunner HD. This is a 7.0 to 1 gear ratio. I like a 7 gear ratio range for my bait casters because I like to catch up with those fish once they eat. A lot of times these fish are hitting it so hard that they're pushing slack in the line from hitting it from behind, and I want to catch up with those fish. And the 7.0 to 1 gear ratio or 7.5 to 1, whatever your brand has as far as that 7 range, is what I prefer to use. However, I don't like to get into those really high gear ratios such as 8s or the really upper range of the 7 range because I feel like you're overworking that bait, you're fishing it too fast, and you probably will pull it away from a lot of fish. So I like this 7.0 to 1. I think that's just a perfect speed, and it allows me to be more efficient. Now, the line that I use is really important. I only use fluorocarbon line, and the reason for that is, number one, I like the combination of stretch, but not too much stretch. The fact that it sinks is also a really, really big factor in deciding whether or not to use fluorocarbon. Fluorocarbon does sink, so I can maintain better depth control with it, and so that's 100% of what I use throughout the year. And as far as the pound test that I use, I like to use 20-pound test Seaguar Red Label. I like Red Label a lot. It's just a really strong line that performs really, really well with baits like chatterbaits, spinnerbaits, and also crankbaits. And I use 20-pound tests, I'd say 70% of the time, but sometimes if I'm trying to get down to deeper depth zones, I'll lighten up, maybe go down to 15-pound test or even 12-pound test on extreme occasions where I'm using smaller chatterbaits and fishing it, on a straight retrieve in slightly deeper water. But overall, unless I'm fishing really, really deep, 20-pound test is pretty much all I use because I'm fishing a chatterbait in darker water, dirtier water, and around vegetation and cover the majority of the time. So that is pretty much my setup, and that's pretty much it. I mean, the chatterbait is just one of those baits that has really transformed fishing and has revolutionized the way that I fish, for sure, for bass and other species too. It catches everything. But don't overwhelm yourself too much. You know, keep it simple. This is kind of the setup that I have, but go out there, experiment with the different ones, use the principles that I've kind of explained here and the suggestions that I've given you here to your benefit. Go out there, test it yourself, and come out with your own arsenal for chatterbait fishing. Hopefully this helps. I'll see you guys out on the water.